The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the designated barriers, cameras ready to capture the iconic sight of the Queen's Guard. Among them stood Karen Mitchell, a middle-aged woman from Ohio who had saved for 3 years to bring her family on this dream vacation to London. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she wore a bright pink tracksuit that seemed to announce her presence to everyone within a 50-foot radius. Karen had always been the type of person who believed rules were more like suggestions, especially when they stood between her and what she wanted. Back home in Columbus, she was known for cutting in lines at grocery stores, demanding to speak to managers over minor inconveniences, and generally making her displeasure known whenever the world didn't bend to her will. Her husband, David, had learned long ago to simply apologize on her behalf and try to smooth over the situation she created. "Mom, can we just take the picture from here?" her 16-year-old daughter Emma whispered, clearly embarrassed by the attention her mother was already drawing from other tourists. Emma had inherited her father's quiet nature and often found herself mortified by her mother's behavior. "Absolutely not," Karen replied loudly, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. "I didn't fly all the way across the ocean to take some distant, blurry photo. I want a proper picture with one of those guards, and I'm going to get it." The Royal Guard in question was Guardsman James Thompson, a 24-year-old soldier who had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 3 years. He stood motionless in his iconic red tunic and black bearskin hat, rifle at his side, eyes fixed straight ahead. James had dealt with countless tourists during his time on duty, from the merely curious to the occasionally disrespectful, but he maintained his professional composure regardless of the situation. Karen studied the scene before her, calculating her approach. She had read online that the guards weren't supposed to move or react, which in her mind meant she could do whatever she wanted for her photos. The barrier separating the tourists from the guard post was clearly marked with signs in multiple languages warning visitors to keep their distance and respect the working soldiers. "David, get your phone ready," she commanded her husband, who was already dreading whatever was about to unfold. "I'm going to get right up next to him for the shot." "Karen, honey, I don't think that's allowed," David said weakly, gesturing toward the barriers and warning signs. "Maybe we should just—" "Oh please," Karen interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "What are they going to do? It's just a picture. Besides, we're tourists spending money in their country. They should be grateful." Without waiting for further discussion, Karen ducked under the rope barrier and began walking confidently toward Guardsman Thompson's post. The other tourists immediately began murmuring among themselves, some pointing and others pulling out their phones to record what was clearly about to become an incident. "Ma'am, please step back behind the barrier," called out a nearby police officer, but Karen pretended not to hear him as she approached the guard. James remained perfectly still, but his training kicked in as he assessed the situation. Protocol was clear about unauthorized personnel entering the secured area, and while most tourists who crossed the line were simply ignorant rather than malicious, they all had to be treated with the same level of seriousness. Karen positioned herself directly next to James, so close that she was practically touching his red tunic. "Perfect," she called out to her husband. "Get several shots from different angles. Oh, and make sure you get his funny hat in the frame." The crowd of onlookers grew larger as word spread about the unfolding drama. Many were appalled by Karen's blatant disregard for the clearly posted rules and the disrespect she was showing to a working soldier. Others were simply curious to see how the situation would be resolved. "Ma'am, you need to return to the designated tourist area immediately," the police officer said more firmly, now walking toward them. Karen glanced over her shoulder with an expression of exaggerated innocence. "I'm almost done. Just a few more pictures." "He doesn't mind, do you?" she said, actually addressing the guard directly. James, of course, did not respond, maintaining his stoic silence and forward gaze. But Karen interpreted his lack of reaction as permission to continue. "See? He's fine with it," she announced to everyone within earshot. "You British people are so uptight about everything." Emma felt like she wanted to disappear entirely. She could see other tourists staring at her family with mixtures of disbelief and disgust. Some were openly filming the incident, and she knew this would likely end up on social media, adding to her humiliation.
Karen then made the decision that would change everything.
Not content with simply standing next to the guard, she decided she wanted a more fun photo. Without any warning, she reached up and attempted to adjust James's bearskin hat, wanting to tilt it at what she considered a more playful angle for the picture. The moment her hand made contact with his ceremonial headwear, several things happened simultaneously. James, following his training, immediately stepped back and brought his rifle across his body in a defensive position. His voice rang out clear and authoritative across the courtyard, "Stand back.
Do not touch the guard."
The police officers, who had been approaching cautiously, now moved with urgency. Additional security personnel seemed to materialize from nowhere, and the casual atmosphere of a tourist attraction suddenly transformed into something much more serious. "I was just trying to fix his hat." Karen protested loudly, but her voice was drowned out by the commotion around her.
"It was crooked. I was helping."
The crowd of tourists had grown to over 100 people, and many were now openly filming the spectacle. Karen found herself surrounded by uniformed officers, all speaking in crisp British accents and using terms she didn't fully understand but that clearly indicated she was in significant trouble. "Ma'am, you are being detained for interfering with a member of Her Majesty's Guard in the performance of his duties," one of the senior officers announced.
"You will need to come with us. This is ridiculous,"
Karen shouted, her voice echoing off the palace walls.
"I'm an American citizen. You can't arrest me for taking a picture."
David finally found his voice, albeit a shaky one.
"Officers, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. My wife didn't mean any harm. She's just enthusiastic about experiencing British culture."
The lead officer, Sergeant Williams, had dealt with similar incidents before, though few quite as brazen as this one. "Sir, your wife physically interfered with a guard on duty and ignored multiple warnings to maintain a safe distance. This is not a matter of cultural enthusiasm." As Karen was led away, still protesting her innocence and demanding to speak to someone in charge, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse.
But the damage was already done.
Multiple videos of the incident were already being uploaded to various social media platforms, and the story was beginning to take on a life of its own.
Emma stood next to her father, tears of embarrassment streaming down her cheeks. "Dad, everyone's filming us. This is going to be everywhere."
David put his arm around his daughter, watching helplessly as his wife disappeared into a police vehicle. He had always known Karen's behavior would eventually catch up with her, but he had never imagined it would happen in such a public and humiliating way. James Thompson returned to his post, adjusting his uniform and resuming his stoic stance. In his 3 years of service, he had never had a tourist actually touch his ceremonial headwear. The incident would require a full report, and he knew it would be discussed extensively among his fellow guards. The morning that had started as a family vacation photo opportunity had transformed into an international incident, with Karen Mitchell at the center of a growing storm she was only beginning to understand. The aftermath of her decision to cross that rope barrier would ripple far beyond the palace walls, affecting not just her own family but sparking conversations about respect, privilege, and appropriate behavior that would continue long after her detention. As the police vehicle carrying Karen disappeared around the corner, the tourists who remained behind were left to process what they had witnessed. Many were already sharing their own videos and photos of the incident online, each adding their own commentary about the American woman who had dared to touch a Queen's Guard. The story was just beginning, and Karen Mitchell had no idea how much her few minutes of perceived entitlement would change everything for herself and her family. The line she had crossed was far more significant than the simple rope barrier she had ducked under, and the consequences would prove to be more far-reaching than anyone could have imagined in those first chaotic moments outside Buckingham Palace. The holding cell at the Westminster police station was nothing like the British detention facilities Karen had seen in movies. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast an unflattering glare on the beige concrete walls, and the metal bench felt cold even through her pink tracksuit. Karen sat with her arms crossed, still fuming about what she considered a massive overreaction to her innocent attempt at taking a memorable vacation photo. "This is absolutely insane," she muttered to herself for the 100th time since being processed. "All I did was touch his stupid hat. You'd think I had attacked the Queen herself." Meanwhile, 3 miles away at their hotel, David was frantically trying to manage the crisis that seemed to be growing by the hour. Their room's phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from news outlets, and Emma had discovered that videos of the incident were already trending on multiple social media platforms under hashtags like #Karen vs Royal Guard and #Tourist Behavior Gone Wrong. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, her voice thick with tears as she showed him her phone. "There's already a compilation video with over 2 million views. Everyone's making fun of Mom, but they're also making fun of us." David sank into the hotel room's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation.
"I need to call the embassy. Maybe they can help us figure this out."
The American embassy in London had indeed been contacted, but not by David. The incident had already reached their attention through official channels, as any detention of American citizens involving the Royal Guard required diplomatic notification. Cultural attaché Sarah Morrison was assigned to the case, and she was not looking forward to the conversation she would need to have with Karen Mitchell. Back at the police station, Detective Inspector Rebecca Hayes was reviewing the incident reports and video evidence. A 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, she had handled her share of tourist-related incidents, but the audacity displayed in this case was remarkable even by London standards. The American woman, Karen Mitchell, age 47, ignored multiple verbal warnings from officers and physically interfered with Guardsman Thompson's ceremonial headwear, she read from the report. When confronted, she showed no remorse and insisted she had done nothing wrong. The legal implications were serious. Interfering with the Queen's Guard was considered a breach of security protocol, regardless of the perpetrator's intentions. The Crown Prosecution Service would need to determine whether to pursue charges, and, given the high-profile nature of the incident, they were unlikely to simply let it slide. Karen's first indication that this was bigger than she thought came when a duty solicitor arrived to speak with her. Margaret Thornton was an experienced criminal defense lawyer who had volunteered her time to help detained individuals navigate the British legal system.
"Mrs.
Mitchell, I'm Margaret Thornton, and I'll be representing you during this process," she said, settling into the chair across from Karen in the small consultation room.
"I need you to understand the seriousness of the charges you're potentially facing." "Charges?"
Karen's voice pitched higher.
"What charges?" "I touched a hat." "That's not illegal."
Margaret opened her folder and began explaining the complex web of laws that governed the protection of royal properties and personnel. Under the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act, it is an offense to interfere with the operation of the Royal Guard. Additionally, you ignored police directions and entered a restricted area.
These are not minor infractions. Karen's confidence began to waver for the first time since the incident. "But I'm an American citizen. Surely that makes a difference?"
"I'm afraid your nationality provides no protection from British law while you're on British soil," Margaret explained gently. "In fact, the international attention this incident is receiving may make authorities more likely to pursue prosecution to send a message about respecting British institutions." The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate Karen's stubborn certainty that she was in the right.
"What does that mean exactly?"
"At minimum, you could face a substantial fine and a ban from all royal properties. At worst, you could be looking at a brief prison sentence and immediate deportation." While Karen was learning about the potential consequences of her actions, the incident was taking on a life of its own in the digital world. The initial videos had been viewed millions of times, and news outlets across the globe were picking up the story. The narrative that was emerging painted Karen not just as an inconsiderate tourist, but as a symbol of American entitlement and disrespect for other cultures. Back at their hotel, David's phone finally rang with the call he had been dreading. It was his boss from the insurance company where he worked in Columbus. "David, I'm calling about the situation with your wife," said Regional Manager Tom Peterson, his voice carefully neutral. "The company has received several calls from clients who have seen the news coverage.
I'm afraid we need to discuss this when you return."
David felt his stomach drop. "Tom, this has nothing to do with my work.
It's just an unfortunate vacation incident."
"I understand that, David, but your wife identified herself as Mrs. Mitchell from Columbus, Ohio, and our company name appears on some of your social media profiles." When she's being interviewed on international television as an example of ugly American behavior, it becomes a company reputation issue. Emma, who had been monitoring social media, discovered that internet users had done what they did best: they had identified the family and begun digging into their lives. Their home address, David's workplace, and even Emma's high school had been discovered and shared online. The comments were brutal. "She's the type of American that makes the rest of us look bad when we travel abroad. Imagine being so entitled that you think you can just touch a soldier on duty. I feel sorry for her family." They looked mortified. The most painful posts for Emma were the ones that included her in the criticism, despite her obvious embarrassment during the incident. At the police station, Karen was finally allowed a phone call. She dialed David's number with shaking hands, her earlier bravado completely gone. "David? David, you need to get me out of here," she said, her voice cracking. "This isn't funny anymore. They're talking about charges and deportation, and I don't understand any of this." David closed his eyes, trying to find the words to explain that their problems extended far beyond her detention. "Karen, we need to talk about more than just getting you out. This whole thing has become a news story. People at home are already finding out about it." "What do you mean, a news story?" Karen asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Honey, the videos of what you did are all over the internet. Millions of people have watched them. News channels are calling the hotel. I've already heard from my boss at work." The phone went quiet for a long moment as Karen processed this information. She had never considered that her actions might have consequences beyond the immediate moment. The idea that strangers around the world were watching and judging her had never occurred to her. Cultural attaché Sarah Morrison arrived at the police station that afternoon to meet with Karen. As a diplomatic professional, Sarah had learned to maintain neutrality even in the most challenging situations, but Karen Mitchell was testing those skills. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Sarah Morrison from the American Embassy," she said as she entered the consultation room. "I'm here to ensure you understand your rights and the process you'll be going through." "Finally!" Karen exclaimed. "Someone who can sort this mess out. I need you to explain to these people that I'm an American citizen and I have rights." Sarah set down her briefcase carefully. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to clarify something from the start. Being an American citizen doesn't exempt you from following British law, and the embassy cannot interfere with the legal process here. What I can do is ensure you have access to proper representation and that you understand what's happening." Karen's face flushed red. "So you're not going to help me?" "I'm here to help you navigate this situation, but I cannot make it disappear," Sarah explained patiently. "The incident you were involved in has attracted significant attention, both here and in the United States. The British authorities are under pressure to demonstrate that they take security around royal properties seriously." As the day wore on, it became clear that Karen's case was not going to be resolved quickly or quietly. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to proceed with charges, viewing the incident as an opportunity to send a clear message about the consequences of disrespecting British institutions. Back at the hotel, David made the difficult decision to call Karen's mother to explain what had happened before she heard about it on the news or from neighbors. "David, dear, what's wrong?" asked Helen, Karen's 73-year-old mother, immediately picking up on the tension in his voice. "Helen, I need to tell you about something that happened today with Karen," David began and then spent 20 minutes explaining the incident and its growing repercussions. There was a long pause before Helen responded. "Oh, David. I love my daughter, but she's always been this way. Even as a child, she never understood that rules applied to her too. I had hoped marriage and motherhood might teach her some humility." Emma, overhearing her father's conversation, felt a mix of relief and sadness that even her grandmother recognized her mother's problematic behavior. Evening brought more troubling developments. The incident had been featured on the BBC Evening News, CNN International, and was trending on Twitter worldwide. Commentary ranged from humorous memes to serious discussions about cultural sensitivity and respect for military personnel. Karen, still in her holding cell, had no idea of the global conversation her actions had sparked. She had been provided with a dinner of fish and chips, which under normal circumstances she might have enjoyed as an authentic British experience. Instead, she picked at it while contemplating the very real possibility that her vacation had turned into an international incident with career and social consequences she was only beginning to understand. The guard on duty, Guardsman Thompson, had completed his shift and was dealing with his own aftermath. His commanding officer, Major Harrison, had debriefed him on the incident and commended him for following protocol perfectly, but James knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Tomorrow, he would face questions from investigators, reporters, and likely his fellow guardsmen who would inevitably have something to say about becoming internet famous for being molested by an American tourist. As the second day of what was supposed to be a pleasant family vacation came to an end, 3 people's lives had been fundamentally changed by a few moments of poor judgment outside Buckingham Palace. Karen was learning that actions have consequences, David was discovering that love doesn't always require defending the indefensible, and Emma was getting an early lesson in how quickly privilege can turn into public humiliation. The story that had begun with a simple desire for a vacation photo had evolved into something much larger, touching on issues of respect, entitlement, and cultural sensitivity. Karen Mitchell had crossed more than just a rope barrier that morning. She had crossed a line that separated acceptable behavior from the kind of arrogance that makes headlines for all the wrong reasons. Dawn broke grey and drizzly over London, matching the somber mood that had settled over the Mitchell family. Karen spent her second night in custody, finally, beginning to grasp the severity of her situation. The concrete reality of sleeping on a hard bench in a holding cell had done more to penetrate her stubborn certainty than all the warnings she had ignored the previous day. Detective Inspector Rebecca Hayes arrived early at Westminster Station, carrying a thick file of documentation related to Karen's case. The overnight duty officer briefed her on the prisoner's behavior. "She's been much quieter since yesterday evening," Constable Williams reported. Asked several times if she could call her family again, but seemed genuinely shocked when she learned about the media attention. "I think reality is finally setting in." Meanwhile, at their hotel, David had barely slept. He sat at the small desk in their room, surrounded by printed emails and phone messages that had accumulated throughout the night. News organizations from 4 different countries wanted interviews. His employer had sent an urgent email requesting an immediate phone conference. Most disturbing of all, Emma's school principal had called to discuss the impact on her daughter's education. "Dad, there are reporters downstairs in the lobby," Emma said quietly, peeking through the curtains at the street below. "I heard them talking to the hotel manager about us." David rubbed his tired eyes. "We're not talking to any reporters, Emma. Not yet. Maybe not ever." The gravity of their situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. David's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from journalists, legal professionals offering their services, and even some of Karen's former friends back home who were either offering support or, more commonly, expressing their shock and disappointment. At exactly 9 a.m., Karen was brought to meet with Margaret Thornton, her solicitor, and Sarah Morrison from the American Embassy. The consultation room felt smaller than it had the day before, and Karen looked significantly less confident in her wrinkled tracksuit. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret began, opening her file, "I've received word from the Crown Prosecution Service. They've decided to proceed with formal charges." Karen's face went pale. "What does that mean exactly?" "You're being charged with interfering with a member of the Queen's Guard in the performance of their duties, and with willful disobedience of a lawful order from a police officer," Margaret explained. "You'll be appearing before a magistrate this afternoon." Sarah Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, at this point, our recommendation is that you consider pleading guilty to the charges. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and a guilty plea might result in a more lenient sentence." "Plead guilty?" Karen's voice cracked. "But I was just taking a picture." Margaret exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else you need to know. This case has attracted international attention. The magistrate will be aware that their decision is being watched globally. British authorities want to send a clear message about respecting their institutions." The weight of this information settled on Karen like a physical burden. For the first time since the incident began, she truly understood that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own inconvenience. Across London, Guardsman James Thompson was dealing with his own challenges. He had been temporarily reassigned to administrative duties while the incident was investigated, though his superiors made it clear he had followed protocol perfectly. The attention was unwelcome for someone trained to blend into the ceremonial background of royal duties. "Thompson, you've got visitors," his commanding officer announced. "Reporters want a statement about yesterday's incident." James straightened his shoulders. "Sir, I'd prefer not to make any statements to the media." "That's exactly the right answer, Guardsman. Let the officials handle the public relations. You just focus on your duties." But James couldn't escape the reality that his face was now associated with an international incident. Fellow guards offered support mixed with good-natured ribbing about becoming famous for being assaulted by an American tourist. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he recognized that the incident highlighted the important role he and his colleagues played in protecting British heritage and traditions. Back at Westminster Magistrates' Court, preparations were underway for what had become one of the most watched minor criminal proceedings in recent memory. Magistrate Eleanor Bancroft had handled thousands of cases during her career, but few had arrived with such extensive media coverage. Court Clerk Timothy Harrison briefed the magistrate on the unusual circumstances. "Ma'am, we've received over 200 media requests for access to this afternoon's hearing." The defendant appears to be entirely unprepared for the attention her case has generated. Magistrate Bancroft reviewed the file carefully. "This appears to be straightforward from a legal perspective, but I understand the symbolic importance. Schedule the hearing for 2 o'clock and ensure adequate security." At noon, David received permission to visit Karen before her court appearance. The reunion was emotional, with Karen breaking down completely when she saw her husband. "David, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted a nice picture for our vacation." David held his wife, feeling a complex mixture of love, frustration, and deep sadness for how thoroughly their lives had been disrupted. "Karen, we need to talk about what happens next. This isn't just about you anymore. Emma and I are dealing with consequences too." "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath. "My boss has put me on administrative leave pending a review of how this reflects on the company. Emma's school has been contacted by reporters asking about her family. And, honey, our neighbors back home have seen the news coverage. Everyone knows what happened." Karen stared at him in disbelief. "But why should you and Emma be punished for something I did?" "Because we're a family, Karen. When one of us makes headlines for all the wrong reasons, it affects all of us." The conversation was interrupted when Margaret Thornton arrived to prepare Karen for her court appearance. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand what will happen this afternoon. The magistrate will read the charges, you'll enter your plea, and then sentencing will occur. Given the media attention, I expect the court will want to resolve this quickly." As 2 o'clock approached, Westminster Magistrates' Court filled with an unusual crowd. Along with the typical court personnel and legal observers, reporters from multiple countries had gathered to witness the resolution of what had become known internationally as the Royal Guard incident. Karen entered the courtroom looking small and overwhelmed. The bright pink tracksuit that had seemed so appropriate for tourist photos now made her appear garish and out of place in the formal setting. David and Emma sat in the public gallery, both dreading the moment when this private family crisis would become a matter of public record. Magistrate Bancroft called the court to order with her characteristic efficiency. "We are here today to address the charges against Karen Mitchell, an American citizen, relating to an incident at Buckingham Palace yesterday morning." As the charges were formally read, Karen stood with Margaret beside her, finally, understanding the full legal terminology that described her actions. Interfering with a member of Her Majesty's Guard and willful disobedience of a lawful police direction sounded much more serious than touching a hat when spoken in the formal language of British law. "How do you plead?" Magistrate Bancroft asked. Karen looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Guilty, Your Honor." A murmur went through the courtroom as reporters scribbled notes and court observers reacted to the admission. Magistrate Bancroft then delivered a statement that would be quoted in news reports around the world. Mrs. Mitchell, your actions yesterday demonstrated a profound disrespect for British institutions and the brave men and women who serve to protect them.
The Queen's Guard are not tourist attractions or props for photographs.
They are working military personnel deserving of the same respect you would show any soldier in your own country. Karen stood silently, tears streaming down her face as the full impact of her behavior was laid bare in formal, legal language. However, the magistrate continued, I also recognize that you appear to be genuinely remorseful and that this incident has already had significant consequences for you and your family. The courtroom was completely silent as Magistrate Bancroft announced the sentence, you are hereby fined £5,000 and banned from all royal properties for a period of 10 years. Additionally, you will write a formal letter of apology to Guardsman Thompson and the Coldstream Guards for your behavior. Karen's knees nearly buckled at the mention of the fine, which represented a significant portion of their vacation savings and would create financial stress for months to come. Furthermore, the magistrate added, given the international attention this case has received, I am requiring that you participate in a cultural education program about British history and traditions before you are permitted to leave the country. As Karen was led away to complete the paperwork for her sentence, David and Emma faced their own reckoning. The formal conclusion of the legal proceedings meant they could begin to assess the full scope of the damage to their lives. Emma, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, finally spoke as they left the courthouse.
Dad, I don't think I can go back to school right away when we get home. Everyone will have seen this.
David put his arm around his daughter, recognizing that the teenager was dealing with consequences she had no role in creating.
We'll figure it out, sweetheart. Maybe we can arrange for you to finish the semester online or transfer to another school.
The irony wasn't lost on David that Karen's desire for memorable vacation photos had indeed created unforgettable memories, just not the kind anyone in the family would want to remember. As they walked through London streets now familiar from news coverage, David realized that their lives had been permanently changed by a few moments of poor judgment. The financial cost of the fine was significant, but the social and professional consequences would likely last much longer. Karen's dream of experiencing British culture had become a nightmare that forced her to confront her own behavior and its impact on the people she claimed to love most. The line she had crossed at Buckingham Palace had led to revelations about respect, responsibility, and the far-reaching consequences of entitlement that none of them had been prepared to face. 3 months had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and the Mitchell family was still dealing with the aftershocks of those few minutes that had changed their lives forever. Karen sat in their living room in Columbus, staring at the stack of bills that had accumulated as a direct result of her actions. The £5,000 fine had been converted to over $6,000, draining their emergency fund and forcing them to take out a second mortgage on their house. The cultural education program mandated by the British court had been completed during an extended stay in London, during which Karen attended daily sessions about British history, military traditions, and cultural sensitivity. The program coordinator, Dr. Patricia Westbrook, had been patient but firm in helping Karen understand exactly why her actions had been so offensive.
Mrs. Mitchell, Dr.
Westbrook had explained during one particularly difficult session, the Queen's Guard represents centuries of tradition and sacrifice. These soldiers have served in combat zones, protected national security, and earned the right to be treated with dignity. When you treated Guardsman Thompson as a prop for your photograph, you diminished not just his service, but the service of every soldier who has worn that uniform. Those words had haunted Karen throughout the program and continued to echo in her mind as she tried to rebuild her life back home. For the first time in her adult life, she was forced to confront the reality that her behavior had consequences not just for herself, but for everyone around her. David's situation at work had stabilized somewhat, but not without cost. After a formal review by his employer's board of directors, he had been allowed to return to work but had been passed over for a promotion he had been expecting. His manager had been diplomatic but clear, David, we know this wasn't your fault, but the company's reputation is important to our clients. The association with the incident has made some of our international accounts uncomfortable.
Emma had perhaps been affected most profoundly by the ordeal.
The 16-year-old had indeed transferred to a different school district, but the story had followed her even there. Social media had ensured that the Royal Guard Karen incident would remain searchable forever, and teenagers could be particularly cruel about viral moments of public humiliation.
Emma, honey, how was school today?
Karen asked as her daughter came home, noting the slumped shoulders and downcast expression that had become familiar over the past months. Same as always, Mom, Emma replied quietly. Someone in chemistry class pulled up the video on their phone during lunch. I pretended not to notice, but everyone was looking at me. Karen felt the familiar stab of guilt that had become her constant companion.
I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never meant for any of this to affect you.
Emma looked at her mother with an expression that had aged beyond her years. Mom, I know you didn't mean for it to happen, but it did happen.
And I have to live with it every day. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell.
Karen opened it to find their longtime neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, holding a casserole dish. But, instead of the usual friendly greeting, the older woman's expression was cool and formal.
Hello, Karen.
I brought this for your family, Mrs. Henderson said, handing over the dish without stepping inside as she normally would. Thank you, that's very kind, Karen replied, sensing the distance that hadn't existed before the incident. I hope you're all adjusting well to being back home, Mrs. Henderson said carefully. The neighborhood association discussed the situation at our last meeting.
Some people feel that what happened reflects poorly on our community.
After Mrs. Henderson left, Karen closed the door and leaned against it, finally, understanding that the consequences of her actions extended even to her own neighborhood. The woman who had brought them casseroles during illness and watched their house during previous vacations now treated her like a stranger. That evening, the family sat around their dinner table in a silence that had become common. David was reviewing job listings from other cities, thinking that a fresh start somewhere new might be the only way to truly move past the incident.
Emma picked at her food, still dealing with the social consequences of her mother's viral moment. I've been thinking, Karen said quietly, breaking the silence. Maybe I should reach out to some of the organizations that were criticizing me online. Not to argue or defend myself, but to apologize and try to do something positive. David looked up from his phone. What do you mean? Dr. Westbrook mentioned during the program that there are veteran support organizations here in Ohio. Maybe I could volunteer with them, learn more about what military service actually means. Emma raised an eyebrow. Mom, do you really think people would want you volunteering after what happened?
The bluntness of her daughter's question stung, but Karen recognized the truth in it. Maybe not at first, but I have to try to do something. I can't just pretend this never happened and go back to the way things were. The next morning, Karen did something she had never done in her adult life. She made a series of phone calls to apologize without expecting anything in return. She called the British Embassy in Washington to express her remorse for the diplomatic embarrassment she had caused. She contacted veterans organizations to ask if there was any way she could contribute to supporting military families, even if it meant starting with the most basic volunteer tasks. Most significantly, she reached out to a local military family whose son had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier. The Kowalski family had been featured in a local newspaper article about Gold Star families, and Karen felt compelled to apologize for her disrespect toward military service. Mrs. Kowalski, Karen said when the woman answered the phone, my name is Karen Mitchell, and you probably saw the news about what I did in London. I'm calling to apologize and to ask if there's any way I can help honor your son's memory. There was a long pause before Mrs. Kowalski responded. I did see the news, Mrs. Mitchell. My husband was quite angry about it, actually. He felt it showed disrespect for everyone who has served. He was right to feel that way, Karen replied. I understand that now, and I want to do something meaningful to make amends. After several conversations, Mrs. Kowalski agreed to let Karen help with a memorial garden the family was creating in their son's honor. It was hard, physical work that required Karen to spend hours pulling weeds, planting flowers, and listening to stories about a young man who had died serving his country. You know, Mrs. Kowalski said one afternoon as they worked together, I was prepared to dislike you. But I can see you're genuinely trying to understand what you did wrong. Karen paused in her digging. I was raised to think that if I wanted something, I should just take it.
Nobody ever taught me that some things are bigger than what I want.
As spring turned into summer, the Mitchell family began to find a new equilibrium. David had decided against looking for work in other cities, recognizing that running away from their problems wouldn't solve them. Emma had joined a school club focused on cultural awareness and had begun to see her experience as something that could help educate others about the importance of respectful behavior abroad. Most surprisingly, Karen had found purpose in her volunteer work with military families. She had started a small non-profit organization focused on educating travelers about cultural sensitivity and respect for military institutions around the world. Her first-hand experience with the consequences of disrespectful behavior had given her a unique platform to speak about these issues. "I never thought I'd say this," Emma told her father one evening, "but I think what happened might actually have made Mom a better person." David smiled, the first genuine smile he'd experienced in months. "Your mother was never a bad person, sweetheart. She just needed to learn that her actions affect other people." The viral videos of the Buckingham Palace incident still existed online, and probably always would. Karen had learned to live with the fact that her worst moment would be permanently preserved for the world to see. But she had also discovered that how she responded to that moment would define her character more than the moment itself. Guardsman James Thompson had returned to his regular duties and had even been commended by his superiors for his professional handling of the incident. He occasionally received letters from tourists who had been inspired by his dignity and discipline during the confrontation. One letter had come from a young American woman named Emma Mitchell, apologizing for her mother's behavior and expressing her respect for his service. On the first anniversary of the incident, Karen stood in the memorial garden she had helped create, surrounded by flowers that honored a fallen soldier she had never met. Mrs. Kowalski worked beside her, and they had become unlikely friends through their shared commitment to honoring military service. "You know, Karen," Mrs. Kowalski said, "my son would have liked what you've done this year. He always believed people could change if they wanted to badly enough." Karen felt tears in her eyes, not of shame this time, but of gratitude for the opportunity to transform her worst mistake into something meaningful. The line she had crossed at Buckingham Palace had indeed changed everything, but not in the way she could have imagined. It had taught her humility, empathy, and the true meaning of respect. The incident would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the whole story. Karen Mitchell had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of the lessons the past had taught her. As evening fell over the memorial garden, Karen reflected on how drastically her understanding of respect and privilege had changed. The woman who had once believed rules didn't apply to her had become an advocate for cultural sensitivity and military appreciation. The transformation had been painful, costly, and humiliating, but it had also been necessary. Emma joined her mother in the garden as they finished their work for the day. The teenager who had once been mortified by her mother's behavior now felt a complex pride in the woman Karen had worked to become. "Mom," Emma said as they gathered their tools, "I'm proud of you. Not for what you did in London, but for what you've done since then." Karen hugged her daughter, understanding finally that real respect wasn't about getting what you wanted, but about honoring what others had earned. The royal guard she had thoughtlessly touched had been protecting something far more valuable than she had understood at the time. He had been protecting the dignity of service, sacrifice, and tradition that formed the foundation of civilized society. The aftermath had indeed shocked onlookers, but perhaps not in the way anyone had expected. Sometimes the most profound changes come from our most public failures, and Karen Mitchell's journey from entitled tourist to respectful advocate had shown that even the most viral moments of poor judgment could become catalysts for genuine growth and meaningful redemption.